Hello and welcome to the Paddock Pass podcast brought to you by Renthal Street. It's a pre-Christmas special on the Paddock Pass podcast today, and we've got our top riders of the 2024 season. We've also got a little look at our top 5 riders that we've seen over the course of our time working at racetracks or being a fan at trackside as well. So it's a bit of a fun show today, Neil, and I'd say you're ready for something like this, Neil, a little bit more light and airy compared to the big news of the day, that Augusto Fernandez is being confirmed as the Yamaha test rider.
Exactly. We were weighing up just before we started recording whether we should do a show on this topic that you just mentioned, Steve, or whether we should do a deep dive on Augusto Fernandez signing for Yamaha as a test rider, or indeed Lorenzo Salvadori increasing his test rider slot with Aprilia for 2 years. But in the end, despite much protestation from Dave Emmett, we decided to continue with our original plan.
Dave, why is Augusto more important than having Stefan Bradl as a test rider for Honda?
Well, for a start, he's younger and he's been racing more recently. That's a good thing. Even though I've lots of love for Steffi B, the man's a legend, and he's done amazing work at Honda. But once again, it shows because he's been signed as a second rider alongside Cal Crutchlow, the press release said. So it's another sign that Yamaha are expanding their test team, really putting all of their effort into actually trying to get competitive again.
Yeah, and Adam Wheeler, I suppose it's worth asking, who's more important to Ducati, Michele Pirro or Tony Caroli?
Goodness, right. Or Jeremy Sewer, perhaps, their new lead rider in MXGP. But
I was just going down the test rider route. That's all.
Right. Okay. So yeah, sorry, Steve. It is test rider day. I mean, let's not forget, December 17th. The announcements are coming out. But I think it's also worth pointing out that in the press release, Augusto Fernandez is at least confirmed as the official substitute rider for Yamaha 2. So if there are any problems with Fabio Quartararo or Alex Rins, who's had quite a few since his leg break in 2023, then, he's going to be the man that's going to be jumping on the M1, Jack Miller and Miguel Oliveira as well for the Pramac squad. So there's a good chance we'll see Augusto racing at least next year.
Yeah. And is there any chance Augusto's in anyone's top 5 list for the year?
Close.
I mean,
It's
yeah,
close.
exactly. Had to think about it for a while, but
Yeah.
then I discarded the idea as completely batty.
Well, I'll tell you what, I can pretty much guarantee all of us have said Jorge Martin is our rider of the year. Can I get a consensus on that one?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Fair enough. Jorge Martin, obviously this is the coveted prize that everyone wants to win. The Paddock Pass Podcast Rider of the Year 2024 in the, well, I should say just in the Grand Prix classes. I'm still putting Top Rack in there, I think, for what he did for BMW and Superbikes. But what about number 2? Adam, who have you got?
Pecco Bagnaia, but I have to point out, Steve, that I kind of put this question, I think it was to Dave on the podcast last week, that it felt like in 2024 Bagnaia he had more impact. I mean, and for me it was really close actually to try and pick between the two. I mean, we know that 2024 was the story of their title duel. I mean, that was the narrative for MotoGP, but I just think it was harder to separate them than you thought. And of course, the championship went down to the last race, so it really was a duel in every sense. But Bagnaia's record is impeccable. I mean, in 2024, okay, we know about the mistakes, but he had. I looked it up, like a quarter of the calendar was perfect. I mean, he won the Saturday and he won on the Sunday in 5 of sort of 20 Grand Prix. And his performance, I think he increased it over his 2 championship winning seasons, and you can't really ask much more, kind of as a team manager. I think his worst result was like a 5th or something, and he was only off the podium once, apart from the DNFs. So, I thought he had a fantastic season, and it came down to just those measly 10 points at the end.
Yeah, I mean, they were both just absolutely superb, both Martin and Bagnaia. But Bagnaia, for me, Martin made a much bigger step in his development. And I think we talked about this last week as well. He was just, a vastly improved rider on last year, and that was what cleansed it for me. And Bagnaia was amazing, but he was making exactly the same mistakes as he made last year, and that's why he lost the championship.
Neil, what about you? What do you think for putting Pecco in at number 2?
Yeah, I think it's a fair shout. I think it would be hard to argue for either rider not being first and second, just like they were in the championship. I mean, we kind of discussed this, I guess, at length last week in our season review show. And what Dave mentioned, Martin made a massive step forward this year in terms of his approach, in terms of his ability to manage pressure. And Bagnaia probably made a step forward in terms of his outright speed. But those kind of annoying mistakes were still very much present and ended up costing him. But maybe it wasn't Bagnaia's best season to date, but it was probably the one where he was the fastest and the most convincing in terms of outright speed. So I think for that, you would probably have to say he would be number 2 on this list. And yeah, there were just so many times during the flyaways when you really thought one of them was going to crack. Today seemed, or you kind of went to the track and they thought, like, today seems really set for, the pressure. You could almost feel it when you were walking into the paddock and you were getting ready for one of them to make a big blunder. And obviously Bagnaia did that in the sprint in Sepang, but generally speaking, on the Sundays, he was so good in that kind of final run of races. So, yeah, I would be hard pressed to put anyone in ahead of him in number 2.
Yeah, so I mean, Martin did everything that you would ask of him. I mean, he improved that consistency, as we said, and it was enough to win the championship. I mean, I think he was on the podium for the last 9 races or something. I mean, that's a phenomenal rate of achievement and focus, and that sort of marks progress. And therefore, he's a deserving sort of man of the year. But Bagnaia also won 4 of the 5 last GPs, and that indicates again that he is perhaps the athlete in MotoGP that can cope most with pressure, and also why 2025 could be pretty interesting, because we know Marc Marquez likes to get feisty and he likes to do what he can to get a competitive advantage. But if Bagnaia has that kind of steely, icy nerve and resolve, then it's going to be a proper duel. And Ducati recently, I think it was a couple of days ago, posted the first of like this Dream On series. It was just the first episode focusing on the Thai Grand Prix. And while I felt that it had its flaws, it does have a certain kind of behind the scenes fly on the wall aspect to it, which is quite interesting. And to see Davide Tardozzi, the team manager, sort of admonishing Pecco, saying you're being too much of a gentleman, you're letting Martin get ahead of you onto the first corner. That sort of, it does make you wonder whether Bagnaia is going to go away this winter and think, I've got to be a bit more of a motherfucker if I want to be, beating Mark and winning a 3rd title. So it'd be interesting to see what his attitude is in the first phase of next season.
Yeah, I think one of the things as well, lad, if you remember the Marquez documentary that he did with Red Bull, we got a good insight into Mark's recovery and the focus and the determination, all that. That little snippet, that's all I've really seen from the Ducati documentary up to now, with Tardozzi, is very indicative of what could be the case next year. Are you going to be like that with Mark? We obviously saw the season started with Portimao and their clash together. So maybe it'll be a little bit different whenever it's Pecco against Mark rather than Pecco against Martin. But for me, in this rider of the year, I can't put Pecco second on my list just because of all the mistakes. And obviously, you're riding on the limit. You're on a tightrope all the time. But Pecco fell off that tightrope too many times. He might have only lost the championship by 10 points, but he should have won this championship comfortably. So for me, I wouldn't put him number 2 on my list. I think like someone like, it might only have been Moto3 compared to MotoGP, but David Alonso's season was much more impressive for me because he didn't make those mistakes. He commanded a full class all the way through the season. He won 14 out of 20 races. So for me, I'd rather have Alonso as 2 on my list and hold Pecco somewhat accountable for throwing away a championship with all the speed that he had and all the wins that he had, the consistency. That was on Sundays. It wasn't on Saturdays.
Steve, yeah, for me, Alonso was P3. I mean, for, the races that he won, as you mentioned, and, just the level of authority that he had in the class that can be pretty unpredictable. And he didn't, he had like an Austrian machine / Chinese, badge Chinese, but, it wasn't kind of like a Ducati sort of superiority scenario that we see in MotoGP. And, that's why above the likes of Marquez, Bastianini, Pedro Acosta, Ayagura, maybe the first half of 2024, Sergio Garcia, Alonso is a deserving sort of bronze medalist in my ranking.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, you guys have your consensus of Pecco at number 2. So we'll put Pecco in at number 2. I've obviously got Alonso at 2. Ad's got him at 3. Neil, you're Mr. Moto 3. Do you have Alonso in your top 3?
Sorry, Dave's Mr. Moto 3.
Yeah, I thought Dave was not Moto 3, man.
No, Neil. I'm gonna.
Here in ahead of David Alonso is all I'm going to say on this one, Dave.
No, I shall let Neil go first because he's actually been watching Moto 3.
Don't lie, Dave.
Dave's been fanboying Moto 3. There's a difference, Neil.
This is true.
You've been watching it with a critical eye. Dave's been watching it with the eye of a compatriot up at the front of the field.
Yeah, I mean, Alonso's season was exceptional in many ways. I mean, the number of records that he broke was ridiculous. And it was a fairly competitive field, I think, in Moto3 at the start of the year, yet he made it look anything but, which I think was an achievement in itself. But, I mean, 14 wins. No one's done that in any class in Grand Prix racing history. Over a single season, which is quite ludicrous. I think he was the first in the lightweight class to win 7 in a row since 1987. It's another pretty ludicrous stat. In a class which is pretty much designed for parity. He had 421 points at the end of the year, more than any other in Moto3 history. His advantage over Holgado was 165 points at the end of the year, which again was the biggest winning margin in terms of the championship in history. And the one that keeps getting me, and I think I've probably bored all of our listeners to death with this one, he now has 18 wins in total, and there's only 3 riders in the entire Grand Prix paddock that have won more GPs than him, which, for a rider who's just had 2 seasons in World Championship, is graduating from Moto3 to Moto2 is quite remarkable. So, yeah, Alonso's season was spectacular. My only caveat would be that it was Moto3, and Moto3 isn't quite as difficult as MotoGP. And he was absolutely lethal in that category, unbeatable. And he did it all with such a kind of boyish charm that you never really got bored, or you didn't really resent him for making the racing kind of predictable and boring. You just thought like, he's a good guy. What celebration is he going to do next? What cute Parc Fermé interview is he going to give next? It was not that kind of resenting someone for their success. My argument would maybe just be that Moto3 obviously doesn't carry as much weight as MotoGP, so I would have him a little further down.
Yeah, but Neil, how could it be predictable if you have 4, at least 3, maybe sometimes 4, 5, 6, 7 riders going up until the penultimate corner, because there's nothing to stop Alonso being elbowed out. It's
because when you've seen it happen in the previous 6 races, that situation, and one rider emerges in front each time, then you kind of tend to believe that that's going to happen again.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Alonso was he was just so much smarter than the rest of the field. I mean, genuinely, the most impressive thing about him is his intelligence and his calmness. I mean, I have a few caveats about David Alonso. First of all, it's Moto3. He's not up against how many world champions was he actually racing against? I think
junior world champions, quite a few, possibly.
And he was racing Colin Veyer, Dave. How
yeah,
dare you?
I know he was right, but he was significantly better than Colin Veyer. I mean, Colin's just an outstanding rider. He's the best Dutch hope, but then that's not like being the best Spanish hope, is it? Realistically, so I mean, it's Moto3, so he's not up against the same level of talent. It's just nowhere near comparable to MotoGP. MotoGP is just absolutely chock-a-block with world champions. And I mean, also a lot of the stats and stuff. I mean, to me, the one that really stands up is the 14 wins. I don't think you can take that away from him, because also he won 14 races, I think, or he certainly broke Rossi's record within the same number of races that Rossi actually scored his wins, if I remember correctly. But the rest, he had 20 points. He had 20 races to score all of those points. That gives him a natural advantage. That's not taking anything away from his achievements. His achievements were outstanding, but you have to be a little bit careful about the outright sheer numerical percentage, or the absolute numbers rather. You should look more at percentages, and I haven't bothered because I'm too lazy. But
it's Moto3.
It would be, yes, exactly. Also, it's Moto3, and I'd have to go through and check the stats for all of the Moto3 races. But
that sounds like a great winter activity, Dave.
How have you not done this yet?
Well, yes, perhaps after between Christmas in the gooch of the year between Christmas and New Year.
Yeah, nice New Year's Eve activity there.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. Better than attempting to mix with people. But no, I mean it's amazing. But I'm not going to put him in. I'm not even putting him in my top 5.
Yeah, but Dave, in the context of 2024, there was nobody that hit it out of the park more.
In Moto3.
Okay.
But Dave, with your top 5 list, why don't we just go through the championship order for MotoGP in that case? And how far down the list do you go then to say suddenly Moto3 achievements count for something? Because for me, the one thing that made Alonso impressive, now obviously enough, I always say this with the caveat of Moto3 riders, it might be their second year in the Grand Prix class, but they've spent 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years on Moto3 bikes in the junior GP classes. Alonso obviously did 2 years in that, and Red Bull rookies, so there's a fair bit of experience on that type of bike straight away. But the thing for me that was impressive was I can't remember even laps where he wasn't inside the top 5 or 6 positions. So he was always at the front. And for me, that's always the thing I look at for whether it's, for me now, it's Super Sport 300 rather than Moto3. But how much of the season are you spending in those top 4, 5, 6 positions? And that seemed to be the entire season for Alonso. I'd say he probably had about 10 laps outside of the top 5 or 6 places. So for me, that shows great racecraft. That shows something that should be transferable for him. He passed the eyeball test for me the same way Pedro Acosta, whenever he came up to Moto3, did. The same way we saw with, you go back to Mark in the 125 days or whatever it is. There's some riders that just do those things. And for me, Acosta deserves a bit of recognition for that, because even if he goes into Moto2, and what was that, Neil?
Alonso, you said Acosta.
Acosta, yeah. Well,
no, I agree. Acosta definitely deserves the recognition.
that'll put us somewhere inside the top 5. We've got a nice mix of Alonso and Acosta. But I think that for Alonso, and I'll make sure to get his name right. For Alonso, I remember whenever he came in Junior GP for his debut, and you knew straight away that he was going to be fast. You'd seen him in the European Talent Cup. So I wanted
Steve,
to see
you
what
were
he
also raving about Artigas. So we gotta be careful there with the Junior GP.
That's not true. That's not true. All I said was watch Artigas this weekend, and he put it on the podium because he had won the Junior GP race the year before. If you wanted to call me out, you'd be looking at Izan Guevara, because I remember whenever it was Guevara and Acosta coming through as rookies, I picked Guevara just because he had longer odds for the championship. And you know what? He deserved longer odds for the championship than Acosta.
Yeah, no, I mean, I take your point, and he was just really, really impressive, always in the top 5. I mean, one of the best things about Moto3, and to an extent Moto2 as well, this year is the improvement that Pirelli's made, that it did sort of separate the sheep from the goats a bit. And you did see the same names in the top 5 a lot of the time, but it was only really Alonso who was always there. But the lead group always had sort of like the same. The good riders were always in the lead group, and I think that was the difference that the tyres make. It allowed the better riders to actually make a difference. But again, I stick to my point. It's Moto3.
Who are you putting in your top 3 then, Dave? Who's third?
I mean, it's easy. It's Marc Marquez. It's quite simple. He beat 2 other GP24s. He was taking the fight to the two best riders on the 2 best bike on an inferior bike. He reinvented himself. He figured out, he was working with a completely new team on a completely new bike, a bike that was completely different to him, completely, which worked a completely different way. The Honda was all front end, the Ducati is all rear end. He had to completely reinvent his riding style. He had to find out whether he was still any good or not. And he came through and he at the start of the season, he was like saying, look, I'm not going for the championship. What I'm here is to find out whether I'm still any good, whether I can still be competitive. And he showed that, and he set himself up. And I think I don't even think he made all that many mistakes thinking back to it. There was one or two, but he was also hampered by the bike a lot. You really saw that at Mugello. He was completely coming out the final corner down the front straight with Bastianini was just absolutely slaughtering him on acceleration, and it was so obvious that it was just the bike and not Mark. Mark was doing so much more to catch Bastianini and pass him and get close to him, and then it just get creamed. It just get creamed on the straight. So it was for me. I mean, again, the way that you judge, and this is also what I have with Alonso, the way the only measure that you have of a rider is by comparing him with his teammate on the same bike, other riders on the same bike. Alonso was clearly better than all the other Moto3 riders because they're all on the same bike. Mark was so much better than anyone else on a GP23, and he was even better than a lot of the riders on GP24, and he was nearly better than the two best riders on a GP24. So I did think about putting Mark up higher, but I mean, Martino Bagnaia has such good seasons that I don't think you can.
Yeah, I mean, he was 219 points ahead of the next best GP23 rider in the championship, which was Alex Marquez. So that gives you an indication of just how much stronger he was than the other riders on the same bike. With the caveat that Didier missed a final chunk of the season due to his injuries, but yeah, I think Dave's point is a good one. I think the only thing that kept Mark out of the top two was the fact that there were quite a few mistakes, and that was only going to be natural as he got to terms with a completely new bike and had to readapt his riding style. We saw quite often in the first part of the year just how long it would take him during a race weekend to kind of come up to proper race speed, and we saw quite a few comebacks from bad qualifying positions on the grid in France and Barcelona and Germany, but more often than not he was there on a Sunday, and yeah, I think from the Red Bull ring on, I think both he and his crew chief Frankie Carcati had really found something with the setting that helped. And from there, he was consistently challenging Bagnaia and Martin. He wasn't always beating them, and sometimes he was rarely beating them, but he was there in the picture. And there was a couple of weekends where you just thought, okay, this maybe is a bit scary. If he's doing this on the GP23, what's he going to be like next year when he's on the exact same bike as Bagnaia? I was thinking back to somewhere like Sepang, where he was running with those two guys in the race on Sunday before he crashed out at the final turn. But Sepang, one of Mark's more difficult tracks in a place where there was clearly going to be a big advantage for the GP24s under the two long straights. So yeah, I think it would be hard to argue for Mark not to be on the top 5 list. I think 3 is probably just about fair. And yeah, again, when you're just looking at the sort of the bare facts and what he did against the other guys on that bike, Bezecchi, Digia and Alex Marquez, I mean, there was just no conversation, no point in arguing their cases against his.
Yeah, the best thing is that, the greatest rider of all time is still firing and he can still bring something to MotoGP. And also you have to credit him for bringing the slight spark to the championship, because outside of the title runners, whether Marquez was qualifying terribly and having to come through the pack or providing moments of drama with his tear-offs or whatever else, then he was often the kind of focal point of many races, the progress that he was making. But I do just kind of I do wonder if he could have done better. I mean, it took him 12 Grand Prix before he took a win either in a sprint or, the Grand Prix itself. And it had to happen
on a worse bike.
Yeah, I had to. Well, I mean, everyone was waxing lyrical in the winter saying that he's going to slay MotoGP, and now he's on the same bike as
we don't
everyone
want to go
else.
back to listen to our preview pod.
And it happened at Aragon, of all the tracks, that was obviously going to be like a banker for Mark. And, as Neil pointed out, I think, or was it Dave, who just said there was a little too many mistakes to really make him push above Bagnaia and Martin. I mean, our colleague Michael Scott in the edition of Motorcourse this year, I should say, ranked him as P1, and I thought that was a little bit over generous. I mean, we all know his skills, we all know his ability, and I think next year could be a bit scary but it was always going to take him time to acclimatise to the Ducati. And I think it's actually a little bit tighter for me between P3 and P4 in the rider list. I mean, I thought Bastianini had, some brain farts throughout 2024, but then he also had a very strong season as well and took 9 podiums. And that was the kind of rider I think the Ducati Lenovo team had signed and had picked over Jorge Martin, for 2023. And that didn't happen, of course, due to sort of his injury and trying to adapt to that version of the GP23. But, I thought Bastianini had a pretty good one. And the fact that he was so close to Marquez in the championship, and what was it, 6 points they were divided by at the end? That was also
a better bike. How can you put Bastianini in there? He was on a super. I mean, like I was talking about Mugello, he was on a clearly much superior bike.
Oh, Mugello, but it's also entertainment factor as well, Dave. I mean, just for his Misano kind of, effrontery alone to Jorge Martin, just little spicy moments like that, you kind of think, okay, he contributed to the story.
I think one of the things for me, and it does a lot come down to your expectations come into the year and whether or not they lived up to those expectations. And I can see where you're coming from with Mark on that. I think that one of the things I found interesting was, Neil, you mentioned about from Austria onwards for Mark. Obviously, Austria was a tough weekend for him. But from that point onwards, he had 3 times where he was the top scorer for the weekend, which hadn't happened up to that point in the season, I think. And suddenly in the last third of the season, he made a step and he looked a lot more competitive, a lot more consistent. But I think there were mistakes from Mark as well through the course of the year. And some of that comes from overriding a bad bike and different things like that. But that was why I had Alonso in ahead of him for my list, just because we didn't have those mistakes.
I think some of the mistakes he had at the end of the year, you can almost write them off because he knew the championship was gone, and it was for him. It was just about trying to achieve the best result possible, and there was a kind of glory to that, riding against the odds and pushing over the edge. Even if it didn't maybe help him in the championship, although, as I said, I think the championship was already gone by that stage. I'm thinking of his crashes in Thailand and Sepang. But also just another thing this year that stood out was watching him, how different it is in 2024. Dave said that he had changed his riding style completely. And we know that Mark used to be all action, and it looked on times when he was qualifying on the Honda when he was winning and when he was having his more difficult years in recent times, that a crash was basically coming just around the corner. He was so loose, so wild. The bike was making all sorts of shapes. And this year, you really saw him trying to ride and having to ride the Ducati as it sort of demands to be ridden. And that is a lot more in line. Like, it's a little bit loose when you compare it to some of the other guys on the same bike. But yeah, you could just see visibly how much of a massive change he's made. And you have to remember that he was acclimatizing to a new bike with one less free practice session than we would have had in 2022, and also with the kind of the scary thing hanging over his head that one big crash could well end his career. He's kind of been quite honest about that throughout the year, that one of the aims of this season was to not get injured again, and that was another thing. Although he did crash a lot, I mean, there were a few big ones, but nothing like the kind of the level that we saw in 21, 22, even 2020, obviously, when he had that big one. So yeah, I think that's another thing that works in his favor.
No, I just think we have to be careful about using phrases like "against the odds" when you're riding a Ducati in MotoGP. I mean, if you spare a thought for anyone on a KTM or a Aprilia or a Japanese bike, I mean, that is against the odds. If you're riding a Ducati, then you need to be in the top 5.
Fair, very fair point, Dad. Yes.
I think one of the things for me is the fact that, like, I know obviously we always make the comparison between the other GP23 riders. Mark is also just a much better rider than the other GP23 riders. And fair enough that there's been that question about his fitness and this, that, and the other. But regardless of that, we're so far past Mark having his injuries that, we're into Mark 2.0 now. And even at that stage of his career, he's still a much better rider than all those other guys. So to finish 200 points ahead of Alex Marquez, I would have thought that is a given really coming into the season, because Alex might spring up and win a few sprints or this, that, the other, have a few podiums. but he's never going to have that consistency that Mark has, and never have that ability to be always at the front. Because when Mark finishes, he's going to score big points. So I think that, you know, the comparison to other GP23 riders for me was a little bit of a moot point. But obviously, the comparison to some of the GP24 riders isn't, because they're on a better bike.
Exactly. That's why you can't compare him to Bastianini. He was clearly a lot better than Bastianini, because Bastianini, he just wasn't competitive. You know, he was not capable. He was only capable of taking the fight to the front a few times, and he got beaten painfully right at the end of the season by Mark. So I think, you know, on a clearly inferior bike. So yes, you can't compare him to the GP23 riders, because he's obviously so much better, but he's also better than almost everyone else on a GP24 as well.
Yeah, I think the other riders on my list were ones that I felt, you know, overperformed this year, and Bastianini, I think, was definitely underperforming.
Yeah.
I mean, that's maybe a bit harsh considering he was fourth in the championship. But
see, I kind of thought he kept in under the radar, though. I thought like around Catalonia or something like that.
Under the radar is underperforming.
It could, but I thought there was a point in and around Catalonia where I thought, Jesus, how is he actually so close in the championship? Because he was doing nothing that was really taking my attention, and
except not fall off.
Well, yeah, but that's a big part of it. Whenever I'm holding holding Pecco accountable for his crashes, I think it's a big part of it.
I think the thing
I don't think Bastianini's up there in my top 5, but it's one of those ones where, you know, he did the job of the number 2 Ducati rider.
It wasn't a horrible season, but he wasn't one of the top 5 riders in the world this year, I don't think.
No.
And the frustrating thing for me about Bastianini is his flaws are still very much the flaws that he had 2 years ago.
Exactly.
He hasn't managed to improve that, which is kind of consistency, starting the weekend well. He's
starting to race well.
Starting to race well, exactly. It's still that same kind of rider that generally shows well at the end of a race than at the start, and he doesn't have that kind of consistency over a weekend that he needs to be a world champion. And this year there was absolutely no excuse him going head to head with Martin to see whether Ducati had made the right decision to put Bastianini in the factory team this year, and it showed, I think, comprehensively that they didn't get that decision right.
I think one of the things as well is when you leave that Ducati situation, then you suddenly get to see what that true level of the rider is. And that's where next year it'll be quite interesting to see what happens for Bastianini. But I think what we'll do is we'll come back to finalize our positions, because obviously it's a little bit of dissent there for who we'd put in as that 3rd, 4th place rider now at this stage. So if we move on to who would be the next rider on the list, because I think it's fair to look at who would be our 5th place riders now, because me and Adam aren't going to move on David Alonso being up in those positions. Marc Marquez is up there as well. So who's in as the last rider on our top 5? So the next rider on everyone's list. Neil, I'll come to you first.
Well, he would actually be the 4th rider on my list, but I'm going to make a case for Pedro Acosta, because we're talking about riders that maybe exceeded expectations or went a bit above. And Acosta came in as the class rookie and was the probably the most eye-catching and successful class rookie since Quartararo in 2019. And what he did at the start of the year was genuinely quite stunning, when he had that incredible run of podiums in Portimao and Austin, and then was up there fighting potentially for victories in France and Barcelona. And even I think back to Mugello, where he got a podium and then was 5th in the Sunday race, and was really pissed off like that he was only 5th.
Yeah.
At that point in the year, it was like, God, this guy is really something else. From basically the first moment that he got onto the bike at the shakedown test at Sepang, he was amazing. Pretty much everyone I'd heard kind of secondhand that some KTM technicians were saying already on his first day in Valencia, he was already the quickest KTM in like 3 corners at the Valencia test. Which showed you just how naturally he was able to take to the bike. And yeah, I thought just that was one of the storylines that really made this quite an exciting year this year. Acosta maybe didn't quite manage to keep that together through the course of the season. He tailed off certainly mid-season as they got a bit lost, I think, with setup. But then he still managed to come back with really impressive performances in Aragon when he was on the podium. You think back to that brilliant wet weather ride in Thailand where he came through the field after a fairly shaky start, his first full wet MotoGP race, and he was up there incredibly successful and on the podium. And there were lots of mistakes. He would be the first to admit that. Way too many mistakes, which let Brad Binder steal in and take fifth in the championship from him. But I think for a rookie, considering just how complicated MotoGP bikes are in this day and age, and the fact that he was on the KTM, which clearly was some way behind both the Ducati GP23s and GP24s, the fact that he was up there taking the fight to them on some occasions as a rookie, Acosta would definitely be top 5 for me, 4th place in my list, I would say.
I think just one of the things that you mentioned there, Neil, about being faster in certain places at Valencia than the KTM riders at that test, it brought me back to the first time Mark rode the MotoGP bike as well, because I remember chatting to what had been Casey's crew, and some of them were saying that already Mark was doing things that Casey hadn't been doing on the bike. And the fact that whenever we get to our top 5 riders of all time, for me, Casey was number 1. I think that kind of shows an awful lot about that talent that he had before Mark jumped onto the bike, because I always rated him as that outright super fast rider, could do something that other riders couldn't. And Mark jumped on the bike, did that, and Pedro's done the same. And that adaptation can turn off a lot whenever you look at what you expect from riders going forward as well.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to remember Neil was saying about the races that Pedro nearly won. He should have had the double at Motegi. Like he was leading but managed to crash out at Motegi. He should have won those. Like it's. I think he just wanted it too much too often. I think if he had got a win at some point, then it would have been a slightly different season. And the fact that he came very, very close to beating the veteran KTM rider Brad Binder in his rookie season says an enormous, and ending up as best KTM, says just an enormous amount about how good he is. So yeah, I mean, for me, he was number 4 as well.
Yeah, Neil made a superb case for the defence. I mean, Acosta is my P5, the best 5th place rider for the 2024. And the only thing I will add to the pie is that I think KTM management made a good decision in placing him with Paul Trevathan, who has a kind of dynamic way of working with riders. It's kind of collaborative. A lot of kind of mutual trust has to be forged. And I think, they obviously hit the ground running from the first test in Sepang. And it is testament this whole season really to Acosta's fierce natural talent. And I think he overrode quite a few times some of the limitations of the RC16 this year in trying to make the best of the Michelin, especially that rear tire, the kind of issue that really plagued Jack Miller and Brad Binder for such long stretches of the season. I mean, we saw it emphatically. I'm trying to remember which Grand Prix it was for Miller. Maybe it was Indonesia, where we had, just a very graphic example of the rear chatter that he was experiencing.
Motegi.
And was it Motegi in Japan? Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, full props to Acosta, and also just for the entertainment factor he provided. I think, as he sort of grows into MotoGP a little bit more, not just as a rider, but as a personality, then also he's going to bring, a little bit more off the track as well. And that will be extremely welcome. I mean, I think 2025 could be really juicy because he's going to have just that extra experience, that extra mileage, not only on the bike, but also, with the Michelins and with that kind of extra experience of the Premier class.
Yeah, I think it's really important to give a shout out to Trevathan there. I think you also saw that sort of in some of the others as well. Pecco Bagnaia matching with Christian Gabrini is just superb. They work so well together. Danny Romagnoli with Jorge Martin as well. Romagnoli understood exactly what Martin needed, kept him calm, gave him the bits that he needed, let him get on with it, and did really well. And Trevathan is just so good at listening to the rider, understanding what the rider needs, giving the rider what they need when they need it. not giving in to them and giving them everything they ask for, but giving them what they need. You know, the old Rolling Stones song about you can't always get what you want, but you can get what you need is exactly what you need from a crew chief. And I think there's some really, really interesting crew chief matches this year, or sort of pairings this year. And you saw that in some places they really made an absolutely huge difference.
Just one other, or two or three other quick things to add. Acosta go into KTM in the summer, basically to ask them, what is going on here, and to go and get to know everyone in the factory. I mean, that's not the actions of a regular 20-year-old. Also, Tech 3 had sort of not really, it had been in the doldrums, hadn't it? It had been getting a bit of a kick in for a couple of years. You think back to the year with Remy Gardner, Ralph Fernandez, how disastrous it was, how outspoken and vocal they were.
Petrucci was a failed experiment too.
Yeah, they really didn't have great times in recent years. And for Acosta to come in with Tech 3, I mean, I remember Hervé Poncharal telling me after his podium in Portimao, like, look, this shows that we're actually not such a bad team. So I think that's impressive. And I did speak to a member of Mark's crew in the tail end of the season, and he was saying, maybe not necessarily next year, but in the next couple of years, the person that Mark is looking at is Acosta, not Martin or Bagnaia. Yeah. So that shows you just the kind of the regard he's held in the number 93's camp.
Dave, just out of curiosity, what other Rolling Stone songs would be something related to crew chiefs and riders? Would it be Don't Stop, Big Mistakes? They had a song called Keeping the Line.
Sympathy for the Devil, obviously.
Sympathy for the Devil, The Beast of Burden. That's obviously, Neil is the burden, Beast of Burden for us. I think that...
Give Me Shelter. How's about that? That's definitely a crew chief song, isn't it?
Can't Get No Satisfaction, also.
I think, I couldn't argue too much with Acosta either. Obviously, I had him in at number 5 on my list. And the big reason for that was he finishes behind Binder in the championship. So that's a bit of a slip up for Pedro. But I think he outscored him in 11 or 12 rounds this year as well. So you were able to see that his peaks were really good. So I think that one of those things for me, you put Pedro in there at number 5 on my list.
Yeah, but he has no business being anywhere near Brad Binder. I mean, this is the point about him. You know, like Binder should have handed Pedro Acosta his arse, and he didn't. And that for me is what makes the difference.
Yeah, but that's also one of those things where you look at it and you think, then, is Brad as good as what we thought he was? You know, when Pedro came in, Moto3, Moto2, MotoGP, all we've seen is a sensational rider. And, you know, maybe Brad is just a very good rider. And when we've seen riders like Pedro come into the top class, they've been able to adapt really quickly. And Neil, you mentioned Quartararo, you go back to Marquez, you go back to Lorenzo, Stone, or Pedrosa, whoever you want to look at. Those top tier talents, they take the winter to learn, and then right from the start of the season, they're ready to go. And maybe Binder isn't in that level. Maybe Binder is in that second tier of riders.
But he did win in his rookie season.
Third race.
There you go. I mean, it was 2020, which was completely off the charts bonkers. But I mean, still, he did win. He was competitive.
They did just throw the RC16 to Acosta and say, get on with it. Whereas with Binder, I think they were trying to say, can you just help us find the last tenths to get on the level with Ducati? I mean, I think they got to that point quickly with Acosta, and that's where maybe he started to lose the plot a little bit. I mean, Acosta made mistakes in Le Mans. I mean, I think the Nadir was pretty much the 0-0 in Misano. It was only when they kind of sort of scaled back a little bit and said, don't worry about having to, both Misano GPs, I don't think he scored any points. But don't worry about having to try and help us as a manufacturer and get it on level terms of Ducati. Just try and get back to your level of competitiveness. Whereas Binder, I think maybe was just trying all year to fight to sharpen that RC16 in some sort of competitive shape, and that's that was pretty much his struggle, as well as trying to many times I think Brad just didn't perform in qualifying. I mean, he would go from a position where he was fighting for the first row to suddenly being right near the back. It was too inconsistent on the Saturdays.
Do we have any other names that we would consider for our top 5s?
Well, I mean, there's some there's been some really interesting performances. I mean, again, I wish I could put Alonso in the top 5, but maybe he does deserve it. But if you think about what Fabio Quartararo and Johan Zarco have done, both completely outperformed expectations, and for me, I think that really the most surprising and impressive rider this year has been Johan Zarco. If you think back to his adventure with KTM, which was such a complete disaster, an absolute failure, so bad he got sacked during the first half of the year, and he comes in, he knows he's going to be on a bad bike, he stays calm, even though there was a few times where you could tell there was frustration creeping into his voice, but he stayed calm. He completely he completely outperforms the Repsol riders. He made a contribution towards making the bike better, setting a direction for the bike. For me, I think Johan Zarco, I mean, do you put him in the top 5? Maybe. For me, he's been one of perhaps the most impressive rider this year.
No, I kind of disagree, Dave. I think, Zarco did a good job, but I think if you're representing HRC, the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, then, to finish 17th in the championship is
but not... HRC suck. I mean, this is the problem is not Johan Zarco. The problem is Honda. Honda are completely lost. I think he's got nearly double the points of either Joan Mir or Luca Marini. Well, I mean, let's ignore Luca Marini for a moment. He was, you completely outscored his teammate.
Are you capable of ignoring Luca Marini?
No,
Possibly even more than Colin Vire.
Definitely, yes. No, I love to listen to Luca, but let's face it, he wasn't going. He didn't exactly smash it this year. He was doing different things, but Zarco so outperformed Joan Mir by so much. It's just not comparable. He's just, and also again, for me, it's the mental side of it. Mir again kept on crashing. He would crash. Instead of trying to slow down, calm down, think about it, and try and move the project forward. For me, the way that Johan Zarco changed his mind, changed his mentality and his attitude, improved himself, helped move the project forward. That to me is the most impressive thing about Johan Zarco.
Yeah, I mean, 17th in the championship doesn't sound like much, but he was 2 places ahead of the next Honda. He was in Q2 5 times when no other Honda rider managed it once. And he had 3 top 10 finishes, which again doesn't sound like much, but whenever no other Honda rider had managed a single top 10 in either a sprint or a feature race, then it starts to become quite an achievement. So yeah, I think Zarco was... Maybe I would be pushed to add him in my top 5, but certainly he would be in my top 10 of riders of the year. And I would also, would Quartararo be in my top 5? Maybe. I mean,
Fabio will be higher on my list than Zarco.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of difficult thing is that Quartararo just had one other rider you can realistically compare him against, and that was Alex Rins, who, bless him, was still hobbling around the paddock. You can still tell he's far from fully 100% fit. Obviously had that horrible crash at Assen, which had him out of racing for a couple of races as well. But I think, Quartararo's performances in the second part of the year were really good. 7 top 10s, 13 top 10s if you include the sprints. And he was rubbish in sprints last year. He made a big step forward on the Saturday and in qualifying. He was getting through to Q2 fairly regularly towards the end of the year. There were no hysterics. There were no kind of dramatic meltdowns that we may have seen from him a little earlier in his career. And right from the start of the year in Sepang, he knew that they were a long way away, but there was kind of an acceptance of the situation they were in, and there was a sort of contentment that at least Yamaha were starting to change their ways and work in the right way. So I think Quartararo was able to really see the bigger picture this year. And there were a couple of races where we really saw 2021 Fabio, that guy riding above and beyond 2022 Fabio even as well. You think of Misano, where he was 5th in the second race before he ran out of fuel coming out of the final turn. I think he ended up 7th, but still 5th place in that race would have been remarkable. And there were times where he was basically challenging the top KTMs, the top Aprilias, times it was almost as if Yamaha had entered into that conversation of the best of the rest, which I think when you look at where they were at the start of the year is a minor achievement in itself. So yeah, I think Quartararo deserves to be in the conversation.
I think for me, the thing for the Quartararo to Zarco comparison is the fact that we know Quartararo is good. He's got 30-odd podiums in MotoGP, so a quarter of his races he finishes on the podium. He's won a dozen races or thereabouts. So his World Championship and his success carries an awful lot more weight than Joan Mir on the Honda having one win and, you know, the crazy season that he won his championship. So for me, I'll give Fabio the benefit of being able to say he got the most he could out of that Yamaha package, even if we don't have teammates we can compare him to. Whereas Zarco on the Honda, Mir might be a world champion, but like, come on, we've been able to see over the last couple of years that he's a very flawed rider. And I think that I'd have Fabio ahead of Zarco for sure.
I think the one thing that makes me think of putting Zarco ahead of Quartararo is just that the Honda is so much worse than the Yamaha. The Yamaha is underpowered; it has its flaws, but it's so much closer to being competitive than the Honda. The Honda, especially up until about, I suppose, the first 15 races or so, the Honda was absolutely up until about Misano, I suppose, the Misano test. Honda was absolutely nowhere, and for Zarco to get that out of the bike, that to me is really impressive.
Yeah, well, but I think also, sorry, Steve, just my 2 cents. I think, you know, Honda, that makes them look even more shit because there are only 2 Yamahas on the grid.
But they are. I mean, that's exactly it. That's exactly the point. Yeah. The problem is that Honda are just in a really deep hole.
Well, let's wrap up this part of the pod, and we'll say, right, Jorge Martin, we've already got him down as our Paddock Pass podcast Grand Prix Rider of the Year. Number 2, we're putting Pecco. What are we doing for number 3? Which of us is seeding that? I'm happy enough to put Mark at number 3. It was very close between Mark and Alonso for me, and the fact that it was in the Premier class carries a lot of weight. But Alonso's season was class. Adam, what about you? Are you willing to budge?
No, for all the excellent sort of stats and reasons and records that Neil mentioned, it has to be Alonso.
Okay, well, I can't imagine that the boys are going to change their tune.
So it's 3 against 1.
Yeah, exactly. It should be Mark.
I will say one thing. I'm only willing to make it Mark if we have Alonso at number 4 on the list.
No, I'm prepared to put aside my objections about Moto3 and accept Alonso because honestly, it was just a deeply, deeply impressive season. I mean, there are question marks, but we'll see next year. I'm much more interested in what Alonso does next year than what he did this year.
So Mark 3, Alonso 4.
Yeah, Adam, are you happy with that?
Well, I'm being outvoted, haven't I? So there we go.
Bloody democracy.
Yeah.
And number 5.
What are we saying for P5?
It has to be Acosta. Yeah, it has to be Acosta, I think.
Yeah,
it's definitely not a Honda rider.
Yeah.
Takenakiki.
Yeah. So we've got Pedro in as our number 5.
I think that's a fair thing. I couldn't, considering the year that we had, I think it would be a bit of an injustice if Pedro wouldn't speak to us again, would he? If we if we left him out of this top 5 list, the kind of the weight that it carries in the MotoGP
because it cares so deeply about our ranking. I'm sure he'll be one of the first listeners of the pod. Do we have to award a badge of shame, or is that like a bit too harsh?
Given it to Honda surely already.
I mean, no, that's actually fun. Raul Fernandez, obviously, because he promised so much and delivered so little.
Well, is that?
But
does he win?
That sprint in Barcelona, Dave.
But that's exactly why, because he showed what he is capable of, and then didn't deliver for the rest of the year.
He's got a new 2-year deal, so he can't be that bad. And also, is he the worst of the Fernandi?
But yes. The expectations, yes, because the expectations are big. Raul Fernandez is incredibly talented. He's so good.
Why did we start Dave on Raul Fernandez at this late stage of the year? The last thing we need is another Raul Fernandez rant. Dave, we've had like 10 of these at least in the last 3 months. So
don't mention
we don't need another
Neil.
Don't say McDoohan's name out. Don't say it.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's move it then to the end of the show and the top 5 list of all the riders that we've seen from our time, either as a fan or when we've been working in the paddocks. The only caveat we had was that we had to be at the track to see them. So will Mick Doohan be on anyone's list for that? Adam, we'll start off with you. We'll go alphabetical order for this one.
Am I first?
Who's your top five, Adam?
Well, coming up with the idea for this, I kind of thought, oh, that'll be fun. But then when it actually came to writing down the names, you kind of realize how kind of impossible it is, really. I mean, it's a good qualifier that you actually had to have seen the person in the flesh racing, because then that does narrow things down a little bit. But my ranking, very quickly, just in terms of favorites, I mean, it's not obviously based on ability or statistics or anything else like that, but just maybe for inspiration or making.
No, it isn't. No, I'll explain in a bit.
All right. My top one's Wayne Gardner. As a kid, he was sort of just the all-out attacking style. I also remember kind of first seeing him race at sort of British circuits around Brands Hatch, and they'd interview sort of this sort of kind of cheeky Aussie over the PA system, and it just sounded like a person who was actually having fun and enjoying being around a really cold, crappy British motorsport facility, and it just was like a breath of fresh air. And just watching sort of his career, it was, as a teenager, he was sort of my go-to. Number two, Barry Sheene, for obvious reasons. Saw him race as a kid. My dad took me to circuits around the UK, most prominently the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. We also went to Spa-Francorchamps and Assen to see Sheene race. So, he made a lot of impact. I mean, is there any other motorcycle racer with quite so many books written about him? I don't think so. P3, Carl Fogarty, just because he was very much sort of the forefront of Superbike, and it being picked up by Sky Sports on British television. It was a bit of a boom time for motorcycle racing in the UK, and he was at the forefront of that. Sadly, now probably more famous for being one of those jungle people and one of those stupid TV shows. Fourth place, Tony Cairoli, multiple world champion in MXGP, and how the Sicilian just completely subverted expectations, moved to Belgium, became one of the best sand riders in the world at a time when riders from Southern Europe were just only good on hard packed tracks. He changed and more from a flamboyant, very charismatic, very expressive racer to someone who could ride economically and just survey a championship perfectly. So he's P4. And then in fifth place, I have just a toss up between Ken Roxon, who was a brilliantly improvisational motorcycle racer, just knew where to pick the lines, pick the places at a time in motocross where a lot of people were complaining about the state of the tracks and being able to overtake. He was giving press conference saying there's always a place to overtake, and he just had like a unique vision of how to take on the others and to win his home Grand Prix at 15 years of age and then sort of sail up through the sport like he has. I mean, there's no kind of career quite like it. And I can remember sales executives at the like of Fox that saying that he was the ultimate marketable motorcycle racer on a global scale. So he definitely made a splash. But I'll put him, equal fifth of Marc Marquez, who, as I said earlier, is the greatest motorcycle racer on the tarmac that I've ever seen. So there we go.
So it's all about people that made an impression on you, not the fastest.
No, because if it's the fastest, it would be quite sort of obvious, wouldn't it? Okay. It was more like your favorite top five.
I thought the brief was.
This is exactly how I interpreted it. I interpreted it as the favorite racers to watch, and my favorite racer to watch was Valentino Rossi, because he understood. We had the doing years, which were dire, and what Valentino Rossi understood was this is entertainment as well. I mean, we saw like the Filipino 2003 was the prime example when he suddenly showed just how much better he was than the rest. Like he was given, I think, a 10-second penalty and took back 15 seconds in about 20 laps. It was clear that he was a lot better, but he knew how to entertain. He knew also how to wind his rivals up just by sort of like sitting behind them. I remember him like sitting behind Max Biaggi, and he could have passed Max Biaggi at any time, but he didn't. He would just wait until Max got nervous and made a mistake. He was just an absolute delight to watch. He's one of the reasons I'm doing this, because he was so enjoyable to watch through the early parts of this year. I do think the 2000 to 2010 version of Valentino Rossi was the best version of him. I think the 2 years at Ducati sort of destroyed him a little bit, and then the arrival of Marquez when Rossi was coming back from those 2 really difficult years at Ducati. He was never the same rider again. His seasons in 14, 15, 16 were amazing, really, really good. But he wasn't as entertaining to watch then either. He was truly great in his 20s. In his 20s, he was one of the greatest riders to watch ever. He was the greatest rider to watch. He was the most entertaining to watch ever. Second has to be Marc Marquez, just because
no
of the thing.
explanation needed.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, he is just the things he does on a motorcycle are just not real. Absolutely superb. And he loves a battle. He will always engage in battle, and that's what you want to watch from a motorcycle racer. Number 3, Troy Bayliss, for very similar reasons. You know, he just never gave up. He was. I saw him in his last race, in his last races at Portimao, the first time ever, 2008, or the first race at Portimao, and he was just a deeply impressive person. He was calm, he was interesting, he was kind, he listened, he talked, and he raced. And there was just he was just so utterly determined, utterly dedicated to racing and to winning. He was a joy to watch, because again, you know, he just never gave up, and he always tried to find a way. For number 4 has to be Casey Stoner, just because he was a magician on the motorcycle. Is he better? Is he more talented than Marquez? I think that's really, really interesting. The trouble with Stoner is that he had more interest in winning than in racing. He could race. He was an absolutely superb racer, but he was, you know, much more interested in winning than in racing. And he could make the bike, the things that he did on that Ducati, those Ducati years were his most impressive, because the things he was doing on a clearly inferior bike were just unbelievable. The way that he would basically use the front, he would lose the front as a way of getting the thing to turn, which is just a mind-boggling thing to do. Just absolutely mind-boggling. I remember talking to Gabarini about it, and he was also saying, like, Stoner would be like in the second sector on an outlap. In the second sector, he would be, if you took those out, they would be anyone else's red helmets. They would basically be, you know, he was as fast on his lap, on his outlap on those second and third sectors as anyone else on there. So he changed racing. But when you saw him race, when you saw him on it was amazing. And finally, Jorge Lorenzo, because you just could not figure out how he was so fast. He was so smooth. I remember, for me, one of the most enjoyable things to do was to sit at turn 9 and 10 in Jerez in the stadium section, sit on the exit and watch Lorenzo come through, and he'd be hanging off the bike through, off the right of the bike through 9 and 10. And then he'd sort of pick the bike up and accelerate away. And everyone else, you would watch them get back up onto the top of the bike. With Lorenzo, he would be hanging off the bike, and then all of a sudden he would be sitting on the bike, and you'd be going, how did he get there? What happened? I didn't see him move. He was like the what is it? The T1000, the Terminator T1000, the liquid metal fella, who would just
stop with the Terminator stuff.
He would.
It's all about the Martinator. You know that.
No, but he would flow. The way that he moved, he was so smooth. He was just absolutely buttery smooth, and that it was. I wonder if it's the same on TV. Actually, getting up close to see it, actually, sort of. Because I was sat on sort of the exit, or actually on the inside of or on the outside of turn 10, looking down that bit of straight, actually watching him, trying to figure out what he's doing. I couldn't figure out what he was doing. It was so smooth. That, to me, the way that he rode, especially the Yamaha, was just amazing.
Dave, does the 2015 season and the kind of manipulation of MotoGP diminish Valentino Rossi's sort of profile or kind of status, in your opinion?
And no, I don't think so. I mean, like he really wanted to win. I think also other people. He got led down a blind alley. He saw he had a chance. He was just desperate to win that last championship. And then, I mean, like basically that argument between Rossi and Marquez has been brewing since the very first race in Qatar in 2013. It was always going to explode. I don't think it does detract. I don't think it detracts from him. I think it detracts from him more now that he's retired. Instead of leaving it in the past, he's still there. He's still bringing it up. But that period, that the first decade of this millennium, he was such a delight to watch. He was such a great racer to watch. He genuinely lifted the sport way above anything that had ever achieved before. And he was just an absolute delight to watch ride. He understood how to make the sport attractive.
Yeah, I have to say, sidestep of the year for Adam there. Not to mention Sepang 2015, but to mention Sepang 2015. Neil, what about you? What was your top five?
Well, I guess I got to add the proviso that I only started working in MotoGP in 2015, and I had been to maybe 5 or 6 races as a fan prior to that. So lots of riders I enjoyed watching when I was growing up. I didn't actually see them in the flesh, so they can't go in my list. And when I was a kid, I was mostly going to watch races in Ireland and on the Isle of Man. So a couple of my choices are based on that. But yeah, Marquez, Rossi, Stoner, for reasons that have already been mentioned, self-explanatory, I would say. Steve Hislop, probably the fastest guy I ever saw around the TT course, just in terms of sheer outright speed. Naturally, one of the most gifted British riders to come from the British Isles, you would say, in the last 30 or 40 years. I mean, Hislop probably had the talent to go right the way to World Championship, to 250, maybe even 500, I don't know. But certainly he was a superb 250 rider back in the day. And he was very up and down, wasn't he? He could, when he was on it, and his mind was absolutely focused, and he was in the right environment. He could really turn it on. And then when he wasn't, it was kind of like watching just a shell of a rider. But when he was on it, he was absolutely brilliant, and I had the good fortune of seeing him both in British Championship and at the Isle of Man several times. And yeah, that was something I would never forget. I was actually proud to be there in '92 when he won the senior on the Northern, which was one of the best TT races of all time when he went up against Carl Fogarty. And also, wasn't he faster on a Ducati Superbike than Valentino Rossi around Donington back in, was that 2001?
2001
or 2? Yeah, it was
2001. It was faster than the 500.
Right. Okay.
Broke the outright lap record at Donington.
Yeah, which is, again, absolutely remarkable. So yeah, a shout out to Hizzy, RIP. And another one, Joey Dunlop. I mean, coming from Northern Ireland, another slightly self-explanatory choice. But if Hislop was the fastest guy I ever saw around the TT, I mean, Joey Dunlop was probably the smoothest and the most wily. And yeah, it was just a bit of a kind of a local hero, was able to take it to the top names in road racing, even though they were 20, 25 years younger than him, kept managing to find ways to reinvent himself and remain at the top when he was 45. I mean, he was even winning TT races when he was 48, just before he died. Yeah, I mean, just a probably stood out for his character as much as his riding ability, because he was just your very softly spoken, quiet guy from a small country town in Northern Ireland. No ego, no big flash personality. Was very much just one of the, if he didn't race motorbikes, he would be lining up on the fence to watch, the racing, in the outside of a hedge somewhere. So, yeah, I think he would have to be on my list as well.
Yeah, I think that's a fair list there, Neil.
Can Michael stand next to him, Neil, in your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, I would. Yeah, Michael is a good shot. Actually, he's not far away. But riders make a bit of a bigger impression on you when you're 5 years old than they do when you're 35. But yeah, Michael isn't. I mean, he's more successful around the TT now, which is something I never thought would happen. But yeah, I would say just because I grew up watching his uncle, he would probably just stay ahead of him on that list.
Yeah, because I think a lot of it comes down to why you became a fan. And if I was putting my list of favorite racers of all time, I'd actually have 2 Formula One drivers at the top of mine. It'd be Senna and Schumacher.
Racer-
for God's
no,
sake.
riders, riders.
Wrong podcast. Wrong podcast.
Shut up. I'm the host here today. Let me finish my sentence. They would have been the 2 that made me a motor racing fan. And then obviously once you start watching any racing, you end up watching all racing. And for me, in terms of it being riders, I think it's always very difficult in a favorite list to not have Rossi up there, because at the end of the day, he's a big reason why all of us are actually able to work in the sport. You know, he helped grow the sport to the same extent that when you were talking about Barry Sheene growing it, that's what Rossi did for us. So, you know, in favorite lists, Rossi's up there. For me, for so long, Casey was the most impressive rider that I saw on a bike. And that was up until Mark came in. So I'd probably put Mark at 2, Casey at 3. And then I saw Joey and some of the Irish nationals. Never saw him at the TT. But that made me a TT fan. And that was actually where probably I moved from being a car racing fan to a bike racing fan, because of someone like Joey. And then for number 5, I'd say that working at the TT to see Hickman, because he's the fastest rider we've ever seen at the TT course. And, you know, he's unbelievable around there. And I think it'll be a toss-up between Hickman, Michael, and right now as well, Davey Todd, because Davey rides like no one else at the TT. And you stand trackside and you just think, Jesus, how did he do that? And he's so loose and brave and puts it all on the line. So he's really impressive at the TT. So I'd go with one of those 3 modern TT riders there as well behind Joey, and that would be my top 5.
Who was your car driver then?
Senna.
Okay.
Because I remember my earliest memory was him crashing at Monaco in '88. I think I was 3. I was in the front room of we moved house probably the next year, and that's the only memory I have of our old house, was watching that Grand Prix. And then I just became a Formula One fan from that point on. And then I became a big Michael Schumacher fan. And then, as I said, went into watching bikes then pretty quick after that as well. But that'll be my list for it. But it's always fun to see what makes up the list, because Dave, you mentioned Troy Bayliss and his need to win, his desire and everything like that. The fact that he just cut his finger off after warm-up, go out and try and win the race at home, because it was his home race at Phillip Island. Like, I would have loved to have been working in Superbikes in 2015 when it was Bayliss racing that weekend, because that would have been really cool to see. Thailand a week later, probably not so cool. But, you know, that would have been pretty special. And Adam, your list with Wayne Gardner up there, and, you know, the ultimate hard-charging Aussie. And then suddenly he saw that there was someone that was even tougher than him when McDoon came on. And you have it where, like, there's all of those things that make riders special. Like, for me, I still remember when Stoner turned up on the LCR Aprilia in 250s, and he had that massive head shake moment at South Africa that seemed to go on for half a lap. And that left an impression for me, where he then always said, I want to keep an eye on him as well. And, you know, Neil, you mentioned about being there at the TT in 92. Like, how can you not be a Hizzy fan after something like that? And that's what you want. That's what racing's all about. That's what sport's all about. It's about trying to find someone to connect with. And I think that, you know, all 4 of those lists have 5 riders that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be able to think, oh yeah, I remember seeing him. I remember why he was special, or, you know, those kind of things. That's what you want in sport.
Can I just say that if you think my opinion about Mick Doohan is bad, you don't want to ask me about my opinion about Ayrton Senna.
I'm shocked, Dave, that you don't think much of a Formula One driver.
Well, Dave, also, if Steve's transitioned from Formula One to bikes, then there's also a chance that you could transition from bikes to Formula One. I mean, you know, maybe we'll see you on some other podcast next year. Who knows? I've
given strict instructions to take me to the vet and have me put down should that ever happen.
I tell you what, you've almost been going to the vet the last couple of weeks, Dave. So
yeah, exactly. Except I'm about to. That's the next port of call if the doctor's appointment doesn't work out.
Yeah. Well, obviously enough, this is the last pod we'll have before Christmas, last pod before the new year. and a nice way to sign off for the 2024 season for all of us here on the Paddock Pass podcast. So as ever, a big thank you to Renthal Street, Fly Racing and KTM for supporting us through the year, and to all of our patrons on patreon.com/Paddock Pass podcast for supporting the podcast as well. We're going to have a chat over the next few weeks as well about what we're going to do on Patreon into next season, what we're going to change, what we're going to try and incorporate. And we'll be back in the new year to bring everyone up to speed on what we're going to plan for next season on the Paddock Pass podcast.